and welcome to Viking Superpowers. This is part 3 in my continuing series based on my trip to Scandinavia and Iceland this year. And I'm talking about the Sky People. I just want to start this episode off with some fantastic quotes. When we talk about myths, we tend to conflate that word with fiction or fantasy, at least in modern thinking. This is a quote from Elizabeth Wayland Barber and Paul T. Barber from their book, When They Severed Earth from Sky, How the Human Mind Shapes Myth, published by Princeton University Press, 2004. They write, "We have argued that myths are not intended as fiction in our sense, but as carriers of important information about real events and observations. We have also given much evidence that, contrary to prevailing belief today, this information can sometimes survive intact for thousands of years." Professor Armin Jakobsson from the University of Iceland pointed me to a really very interesting book. It's called Lost Knowledge, The Concept of Vanished Technologies and Other Human Histories. This is by Benjamin B. Olshan, who's a professor of philosophy and the history and philosophy of science and technology and design at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. The overview of the book states, "This book examines the idea of lost knowledge, reaching back to a period between myth and history. It investigates a peculiar idea found in a number of early texts, that there were civilizations with knowledge of sophisticated technologies, and that this knowledge was obscured and or destroyed over time, along with the civilization that had created it. This book presents critical studies of a series of early Chinese, South Asian, and other texts that look at the idea of specific lost technologies, such as mechanical flight and the transmission of images. There is also an examination of why concepts of a vanished golden age were prevalent in so many cultures," which is exactly what we're doing here at Viking Superpowers. Opening our minds, re-examining ancient stories and artifacts, looking for potential truths that are hidden in plain sight, hidden by centuries of closed-mindedness, and even perhaps by direct authoritarian suppression. I feel very lucky to be able to investigate the ancient North because it is, as my friend Colonel John B. Alexander says, a path less trodden. In today's episode, we're going to look into a flying adventure had by one of the most infamous and famous characters from the Old Norse sagas, Loki, known to modern audience because of his movies in the Marvel Universe. I'm going to look into these two favourite books of mine, the Edda Snorri Sturluson, and two particularly good English translations, and I'll also be using my own translations. I'll start by telling you the story in English. It's from this terrific translation known to a lot of people, the Edda by Snorri Sturluson, by a great writer, Anthony Fawkes from the University of Birmingham. The Wizard King, one of the Wizard Kings of Sweden, there's two mentioned in Gylfaginning, the first book of the Snorri Edda, the Prose Edda. It's called Gylfi, and I've covered him in the past, and I'll be covering him more. That Wizard King, I believe, was abducted by the Aesir and told about all sorts of amazing things, and then sent back to Earth to tell people the stories he'd been told as part of a plan to take over the North by these people called the Aesir. I call them the Elohim of the North. In the second book, in the Prose Edda, we find the story of Aegir, and this book is called Skaldskaparmal, the language of poetry. A skald is a traditional poet and a remember of the ancient history and a very important person. So this is a story of Aegir, who is variously known as a giant, as a sea god, but he's also called a wizard. He also appears to have been abducted, not so obviously as what happens to Gylfi, but I feel the way the story pans out sounds like he was grabbed and taken. So he's taken to this place where the gods are meeting, and he's told these stories. In his case, he's brought to a feast, and there's a lot of interesting things happen at that feast, including the fact that he sits down for the feast and they bring in these glowing swords that throw such a light that the whole room is lit up. and I made a video about that earlier, a fair bit earlier. And he's introduced to all these so-called gods, and he's told stories. So this is the first story that's told to him by a particular Aesir, one of the Aesir called Bragi, who sits beside him. And Bragi, we know it as bragging or brag, and it's very closely linked to poetry. So Bragi says, Odin and Loki and Heinir set out and crossed mountains and wildernesses, and food was difficult to come by. And when they came down into a certain valley, they saw a herd of oxen, and took one of the oxen and set it in an earth oven. And when they thought it must be cooked, they opened the earth oven, and it was not cooked. And the second time, when they opened the oven, after some time had passed, it was still not cooked. Then they heard someone talking in the oak tree up above them, saying that the one who was sitting there claimed to be responsible for the oven not cooking. They looked up, and it was an eagle sitting there, and no small one. Then said the eagle, If you will grant me my fill of the ox, then the oven will cook. They agreed to this. Then it let itself drop from the tree, that's the eagle, and sat on the oven, and to begin with immediately put away the ox's 2 hams and both shoulders. Then Loki got angry and snatched up a great pole and swung it with all his strength and drove it at the eagle. The eagle jerked away at the blow and flew up. Then the pole was stuck to the eagle's body and Loki's hands to the other end. Something happened. Why did it stick to the eagle's body, and why did his hands stick to the other end? The eagle flew at such a height that Loki's feet banged down against the stones and gravel and trees, and his arms, he thought, were going to be wrenched from his shoulders. He shouted and begged the eagle most earnestly for a truce, but it said that Loki would never get free unless he allowed solemnly to get Idunn, in the Norse Ithun, to come outside Asgard with her apples, and Loki accepted. Then he got free and went up to his comrades. So he's been dragged a fair way away from Odin and Heinir. And nothing else noteworthy was told for the moment of their expedition until they got home. But at the agreed time, Loki lured Ithun out through Asgard into a certain forest, saying that he had found some apples that she would think worth having, and told her she should bring her apples with her and compare them with these. He's a tricky, sneaky one. Then giant Thiazzi arrived in eagle shape and snatched Idunn and flew away with her to his home in Thrymheim. But the Aesir were badly affected by Idunn's disappearance and soon became grey and old. Then the Aesir held a parliament and asked each other what was the last that was known about Idunn. And the last that had been seen was that she had gone outside Asgard with Loki. Then Loki was arrested and brought to the parliament, and he was threatened with death or torture. Being filled with terror, he said he would go in search of Idunn in Giant Land if Freya would lend him a falcon shape of hers. Note what it says, would lend him a falcon shape of hers. And when he got the falcon shape, he flew north to Giant Land and arrived one day at Giant Thiazzi's. He was out to sea in a boat, but Idunn was at home alone. Loki turned her into the form of a nut and held her in his claws and flew as fast as he could. Then Thiazzi got home and found Idunn was not there. He got his eagle shape and he flew after Loki, and he caused a storm wind by his flying. And when the Aesir saw the falcon flying with the nut, and where the eagle was flying, they went out under Asgard and brought their loads of wood shavings. And when the falcon flew in over the fortification, it let itself drop down by the wall of the fortification. Then the Aesir set fire to the wood shavings, and the eagle was unable to stop when it missed the falcon. Then the eagle's feathers caught fire, and his flight was ended. Then the Aesir were close by, and killed giant Thiazzi within the Alce gates, and this killing is greatly renowned. So if we go back to the start of that story, we see that after the episode with the eagle coming down and eating half the ox. Loki gets very angry, and it's still just being called just eagle, just an eagle. Loki hits it with a big pole, and it says, "Thou var Loki reither." Then was Loki angry, og grep upp mikla stong, og reithir af öllu afli og rekkar af kroppin erninum. So he got the great big stick and he whacked away. The eagle started to fly, and Loki's big stick got stuck to the eagle somehow, and he couldn't let go of it, and he was being dragged. Now, I think of a Tom Cruise movie, one of those sort of action movies where the hero's grabbed hold of a helicopter's runners, and the helicopter's taken off really fast, and he can't let go because he's going to get hurt, and so he's being dragged through the trees, dragged over stones, until he yells out to stop, to stop. So the eagle lands down, and then a conversation's had where the giant Thiazzi, who's in this eagle somehow, basically lays down the law that I'll let you go if you promise to bring out the goddess Idunn, who has the apples of immortality. That's what I want. So if you do that, I'll let you go. So Loki promises. Next thing, Loki takes the goddess outside of Asgard, sort of talks her into going out. He says there's special apples out here. And we've got to ask ourselves, what are these apples? I think of it as some kind of gene therapy that they have to regularly take, and maybe Idunn was the head scientist in charge of that, the great biologist of this team of gods who are for some reason here on the earth wanting to take over the north. They've been ruling in Anatolia and Turkland in their area, competing with the Vanir, who might be from Lake Van. It says Loki has tricked Idunn to go outside. It's a very traitorous sort of thing to do, and it says, "Thou kemur thar Thiazzi Jötun I Arnaham, og tekur Idunni og flýgur brot með ok I Thrymheim til bussins." So essentially, then came giant Thiazzi in Arnaham. Now, it hasn't said that before. It's just been saying Arna or Orm, which straight out means eagle. Arnaham means eagle shape. Now, it's often translated as an eagle skin, and sometimes a feather shape, an eagle feather shape. But these are just sort of people scratching at what is this about, because the word ham has different meanings, but it definitely means a shape. So I think that this means something shaped like an eagle, basically an aircraft. So he comes in, and we can see in that first story the eagle seems to be hovering. It's up above the trees and it comes down and lands. We then move on to the story how the gods are very ill and sick and old because they haven't got Idunn's apples, and it doesn't say exactly how long this takes, but pretty soon they've lost their youthful, vigorous beauty, and they're all getting really ancient, and they're not happy about it, and they find out that Loki was the last person seen with Idunn. So they get him and they threaten him with torture and death, as you do. And he's frightened, which is a very mortal sort of response, isn't it? It's not really a all-powerful God response. He's frightened. He goes, no, don't do that to me. I don't like pain. Don't want to die. I'll do what is needed to do, which is a sort of a brave thing, really, even though he's been threatened to do it. But he says, "Thou kwas kan mundu sekjar eftir Idunni I Jotunheimar." Then he said that he would seek after Idunn in Jotunheim, which is usually translated as giant's world, the giant world, giant home. What a giant is another subject, not necessarily somebody really huge. If Freya vil ljá honum valdshams, which means if Freya will lend him a hawk's shape, hon á, which she has. So here we have two. We have Arnaham, eagle shape, and we have Valdsham, which is a hawk shape. So he says, lend me your hawk shape. So off he flies, and it says that he flies off in the Valshamn, and he comes one day to Thiazzi Jötuns. So it takes more than a day for him to fly there, so he's not going some supernaturally fast speed. He's actually travelling at a speed that it would take more than a day to get there. So he came to where the giant lived, and Loki saw that the giant Thiazzi was roen á sé, which means rowing in the sea. I really like the sound of that. Idunn var ein heima. Idunn was the only one home. Brá Loki henni í hnottalíki. Loki put her into a nut shape, hnottalíki. And I think of this as some kind of capsule, maybe in the side of the Valshamn, the hawk shape. If it's a craft, maybe it had like a rescue pod that she could be put in, because it's sort of like a fighter. It sounds like a fighter plane, like a single-seater, but it also sounds like you can sort of attach, you got weapons pods, and I think they actually do have this in some aircraft, a pod that you can put an emergency stretcher for an injured person in. And he puts her into that, which they call a nut in most myths. He flies off with her, and then Thiazzi comes home and looks for Idunnar, and then he's like, where is she? And he realizes that, maybe somebody says, well, I just saw a craft fly in here and then fly away. So he puts two and two together and thinks that Loki's come back. He's double-crossed me. So it says in the translation that Loki flew off as quick as he could, and Thiazzi, the giant in the eagle shape, went after him so fast that he caused a storm wind by his flying. Now, this is really interesting, because if you can give me the credibility of thinking there could be something to this, you've got craft that are called eagle shape and hawk shape that seem to take off and land in a VTOL sort of way, vertical takeoff and landing, or short takeoff and landing manner, which is the way the eagle came down in the start of the story with the ox. It doesn't say that in this, but Loki puts Idunn, the doctor, the immortality doctor, puts her into a pod, takes off as fast as he can. The giant jumps into his eagle shape, takes off after her, and he flies so fast that he causes a storm wind behind him, which really is a great way to describe, if you're trying to describe a jet, the sound of a modern jet. If you get close to a big jet, especially a military jet, they have an incredible roar. And I guess if you're scratching for something to describe it, you'd say it was like a great storm wind. The giant gives chase, and it says next, En ásinir sá, valrin flóg með knottenar, og hvar onin flóg, þá gengu þeir ut undir Asgard, og baru þannig Byrður at Loka spánum. So this means, and when the Aesir saw the falcon shape flying with the nut, which is the pod containing Idunn, and where the eagle was flying, they went out under Asgard and brought their loads of wood shavings. So in the Old Norse and in modern Icelandic, when they say under, like under a mountain, it sort of doesn't mean actually under it, but in front of it. But in this case, like sort of below and in front, but in this case, it could be actually under Asgard, as in like a tunnel system, because in my next video, I'm going to take you to a place in Sweden that is called Asgard, and I think could be the original Swedish Asgard. It's pretty far out. So they went under there and they gathered loads of wood shavings. And when the falcon flew in over the fortification, that's the Valsham that Loki's flying, it let itself drop down by the wall of the fortification. So there's that VTOL aspect where it's basically dropping down. The girl gets out, they pull it into the hangar, and then basically the giant Thiazzi comes roaring over in his eagle shape, and maybe he's firing his cannons or his rockets. And it says that they set fire to the wood shavings, and the eagle was unable to stop when it missed the falcon. Then the eagle's feathers caught fire, and his flight was ended. Then the Aesir were close by and killed giant Thiazzi within the Al's gates. And this killing is greatly renowned. So what we have here is a story of a fighter battle, and it would make a good movie. It's, I assume, a beautiful woman, young woman who's extremely competent, technically can turn back time, can make people younger, and we'd all love to get a hold of that medicine. She's desired by the giant Thiazzi because he's probably getting old. He wants to get a hold of that technology for him and probably his own family and people. He goes and sets it up through circumstances that happen. He's got Loki to do what he wants and bring the young girl, the scientist, doctor, out. He comes flying in his eagle shape, grabs her, takes off again, flies all the way to Giant's home, Jotunheim, to his fortress. Then Loki gets convinced the hard way that he's got to, make up for the terrible thing he's done by all the gods who are suffering terribly from suddenly becoming old because they haven't got their medicine. He flies fast as he can, takes him over a day to get there, comes over the fortress, sees that Thiazzi's out fishing, he obviously doesn't think anyone's coming after him. Loki drops in. Girl runs out. He says, I can't put you in the cockpit. You'll have to go in this pod. She goes, oh, no. I'm scared of heights. And he just says, no, sorry, darling. There's nothing we can do. Got to get in the pod. Keep your eyes closed. You'll be right. Take off. Thiazzi's come back. Maybe he's got a motorboat. Maybe he wasn't really rowing. Maybe he was, had a speedboat. He saw Hawkshake come in, or maybe he didn't, or just heard something as they're taking off. Went in as quick as he could. His people told him, that guy Loki came in, one of those Aesir. He grabbed Idunn and he's taken us. So quick, heat up the eagle shape. They get it running. Probably quick start, high tech. Gets in, takes off. Following him all the way. The little probably the big eagle shape's got more power, but the hawk shape's lighter. Maybe a little bit more speed, but he keeps ahead of him. Maybe they're shooting at each other. Maybe, it's just Loki is getting shot at, but he's determined to get there. The people in Asgard, the Aesir, they've got, probably radar or viewing systems of some kind. They see what's going on. They haven't got time to scramble any more fighters, but they go and load up their anti-aircraft defences, which are called wood shavings in the story. Loki roars in, comes down, lands. They get the girl out, get the craft out of the way. Here comes the big eagle shape for the final attack, and takes his tail off, comes crashing down, crashes inside Asgard. The Asgardians run forward and do him in some manner, and that leads to all sorts of other stuff. But that's a story for today, and I think it's a great story, and I would sort of encourage you to read it for yourself. If you've got this book, the Edda. It's actually, you can find it online as a PDF if you go digging. And it's in the book called Skaldskaparmal, lines 56. These modern translations don't always have really good numbering for some reason, at least the ones I've got here, but it's definitely at the start of Skaldskaparmal. You won't miss it. I'd be very interested to hear what you think. I had somebody write to me in the comments and say that why don't I leave the stories alone and just let them be stories of shamanism and myth, etc. And I respect that opinion, I really do. I understand that for some people what I'm talking about might be offensive. Depends how emotionally invested they are in a particular view. Me personally, I'm very open-minded, and I really do think this absolutely has legs. It's literally being admitted by, the Pentagon. Governments around the world are starting to give us some kind of disclosure saying, yes, there are craft, and there have been craft for a very long time in our atmosphere. There's beings here that are not human, they're sort of humanoid, and what I'm finding in the old sagas is extremely interesting. So I'll see you next time.